Hey guys, so over the years I have noticed that there are generally two different kinds of learning that my students do. The first one is basically an immersion type of learning. All they do is they come into lessons, soak up everything I have to say, and then they go home, they practice it, and then they come back, and then the cycle continues. So there's not really much self-research on their part. They just kind of soak it up and learn as they go. As far as I have noticed, this is primarily how most children learn most things. You know, you just kind of go to school, you soak it up, you learn it. Sometimes you don't even realize you're learning it. Like, think of all the things that you know how to do right now that just seem instinctual. It's most likely because as a kid, you probably watched some adult do it, you imitated it, you learned it, and then it kind of became part of your nature. A lot of young students end up learning instruments this way. So if you think about those really young, gifted musicians who just kind of play their instrument like it's no problem, you kind of want to think of it as if like that's one of their first languages. There's a kind of ignorant bliss that comes with these kinds of students because they don't necessarily know how well they could play in the future. They just know that they're doing well for now because they're doing well in their lessons. Well, hopefully they're doing well in their lessons. So if there's any frustration, usually it comes from having to repeat the same exercises over and over again. Things feel boring. You don't know why you're doing these technique exercises, etc., etc. I do realize I'm generalizing quite a bit. There are a few outliers in here and there, but generally this is what I noticed from my own teaching experience. The second big category of students that I have taught are the kind that are super self-aware and very critical of themselves. These students tend to start later in life, or they have picked up their instrument again after many, many years of not playing it. Now, the reason why these kinds of students tend to be a lot more self-aware and a lot more critical is because they have had more time, more exposure, they know how to do their own research, and they know how to look up for themselves how other professional musicians play. These kinds of students have a really painful awareness of how far they have to catch up. Usually to them, only having a private instructor to hold your hand as you go through your musical journey is not enough to satiate their hunger to learn more. Their understanding of expression, musicality, music history, and music theory can be extremely advanced, but it takes a lot more time for their physical body to catch up to play at that level. All right, so now that we have talked about these two very general categories of students, I now want to share with you my own very awkward transition between immersion learning and self-teaching learning. I started piano lessons when I was 7, and then I started flute lessons when I was almost 9. Definitely was still at the age of just kind of soaking everything up. At the time that I was 7 to 9 years old, the internet was a baby. I think I sent my first email to my uncle as a practice with my mom's coaching. Especially as a 7 to 9-year-old little girl, I was definitely not allowed on the computer to look up anything. I didn't even know at that point that you could look anything up on the internet. This was definitely not the age of iPads and stuff like that, you know, no YouTube or anything. So yes, I do understand that students these days probably have an entirely different experience in terms of learning now, but this is just my story. So I was expected to just go to lessons, soak up the material, go home, practice the material I soaked up, and then go back again to either be praised for how good of a job I did or to be completely ripped to shreds because maybe I practiced it completely wrong, and then I either go back and polish it again or we move on to the next thing, and then the cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. And that was just my music life. And then I ended up in a music school. Now, the type of music school I'm talking about is an actual Bachelor of Music degree at a university. I am fresh out of high school. I'm 18 years old. So it's been 9 years of these type of flute lessons where I just kind of go in, soak it up, go back home, polish it, go back to lessons, you know, like back and forth, back and forth. And there was really no research involved. I also never really cared that much how my lessons went because they were all extracurricular prior to going to university. But in university, suddenly my grades and my degree kind of really depended on how well I did on those lessons. So as you can imagine, my stress levels skyrocketed. Going to lessons became a really huge ordeal for me. It always felt like once I was out of a lesson, the relief would just like tsunami over me, and I just would not practice for like a day or two because I just didn't want to think about my lesson. And then I would cram practicing in like the last 3 to 4 days before the lesson, and then I would start shaking before the lesson, and then I would go in and just be absolutely terrified of my lesson, and then the cycle would repeat again. I would get out of the lesson, and then a tsunami of relief would come over me, and then I would also not practice again for another couple of days before I came back to again. So that became my new lesson cycle. Let's explore why I was so stressed. All of a sudden, in my university flute lessons, I kind of felt like I wasn't actually being taught anything. And it took me way too long. Now that I look back, I think it took me almost 2 years to figure this out. But I did finally realize that practicing just the notes in my music is not gonna cut it for university flute lessons. The entire time that I didn't know I was expected to do this, I was expected to do research on the composer and the era of all of the repertoire that I was studying, including orchestral excerpts, sometimes even including etudes. I should have been listening to recordings of all the pieces. I know that for a lot of you guys watching this, because most of you who have found my channel tend to be more self-taught people anyway, so this might sound completely weird and unrelatable to you, but I'm just sharing my story. This is what happened to me. So I didn't actually listen to the recordings of the pieces that I was playing. I listened to other flute music, but you know, for fun, because I thought of listening to music as a fun thing. I never thought of it as like research and work and homework. On top of that, I should have been listening to multiple recordings and formed my own opinion, my own interpretation of the pieces that I was studying. And on the technical side of things, I should have been the one to look up tremolo fingerings, weird trill fingerings, alternate fingerings. I had never felt the need to do that because I was always taught that in the lessons. So yes, I should have been doing a lot of research. And in fact, I mean, that research should have been common sense, right? But for a person who has only been learning the flute via immersion type learning, where you just kind of go and soak up whatever the teacher says, researching was not a desire in me. It was not something I wanted to do. In fact, it didn't even exist in my mind. Researching music, like, no, you only do that in music history class when you actually have to write a paper. In my world, researching music was not even a thing that you could think of doing on your own. It was so out of the realm of how I was used to learning. So I know what you're thinking. Wow, Joanna, you were spoon-fed like crazy. If you include like the 2 years prior to starting the flute when I started piano, you can say that I had actually been spoon-fed all of my music education for 11 years prior to getting into university. Now the thing is, spoon-feeding teaching is not a bad thing either, because if you think about it, when you are a private music teacher for these students who are only taking you on as a teacher for their extracurricular activity, you can't actually really expect them to go and do a whole bunch of research on their own time. So that's why you end up teaching a lot of the things that they would research on their own in the lesson, because you already know that they don't have the time. They're already doing your lesson as an extracurricular activity. Now, some teachers will disagree with me, and that's fine, because there are lots of different teaching philosophies, and each teaching philosophy works better with some teachers and students than others. So here I am now in my university lesson, just completely confused. I felt like I was expected to know things that I was not told. I thought that you're the teacher and you're supposed to teach me these things that I don't know. So whenever my teacher asked me if I knew anything about the history behind my music, if I knew anything about the composer, did I know anything about the form and style of the pieces that I was studying, I thought it was a rhetorical question. You know how usually like in lessons, teachers will be like, oh, do you know about this? And you're like, No, but really that is just the teacher's kind of segue into them teaching you about the thing that they just asked you about. So I thought it was that, but it wasn't. Yeah, that made things real awkward. There was a lot of me staring at her, expecting her to tell me, and then her staring at me because she's like, WTF, why didn't you look this up? She was expecting something different from me as a student, and I was expecting something different from her as a teacher. The expectations of what was supposed to happen in the lesson was completely clashing. So as you can imagine, these lessons not only are super disappointing and awkward, they're also incredibly intimidating now because I don't know how much I'm supposed to know now. So after almost 2 years of these kinds of lessons, everything finally clicked. I realized that part of my practice time should actually be researching my music. Okay, I know for most of you watching this video, you're like, wow, Joanna, wow, you are dumb. And yes, I completely agree with you. By the time I finally sat down to do research for my music, I was only thinking about how my teacher was just going to give me a very deep sigh of disappointment. I thought of how her eyes look at me with disapproval, and I was constantly scared that I wasn't researching enough. My kind of personality, when I am faced with that kind of stress, it's not very good, I know, but my personality tends to shut down. And if you shut down when you're doing research, it doesn't matter how many books and how many websites you pull up in front of your face. Once you shut down, you're not actually reading any of it. So that, of course, makes researching music incredibly grueling, taxing, torturous, really. Instead of, explorative and fun and enlightening, which it should be, but it was not any of that for me. My lessons were pretty darn bad. From my teacher's perspective, she's looking at me and going, what am I going to do with this girl? There's so much material at hand. She is supposed to look up all this information on her own, and I'm just supposed to, pick up on her blind spots and to teach her things that are not available on the web and not available in the library. While on my end, I think that I am playing my etudes really well. I think that I am playing my Bach really well, but I played the Bach romantically. So yes, that did inspire my other video about playing Handel romantically. And I would play my etudes at half speed while I thought they were at full speed, even though there are many recordings out there of my etudes that prove otherwise. So no, I don't blame her for these dozens and dozens of disappointing lessons. It was really just flat out a clash of expectations. Side note, you guys are probably wondering why I studied with her. If we had such a big clash, the university was closest to where I lived, so it was cheaper. So now you guys are probably thinking, okay, Joanna, you're on YouTube now. You must have gotten over your stress and anxiety over researching music, right? I ended up doing the procrastinating version of procrastination. I mentioned in another video that when I didn't want to practice my actual repertoire, I would practice other things to practice tone. So I would play the Lord of the Rings Hobbiton theme all the time. Basically, I did research procrastination. I would try and look up funny things. I found a book that had like a whole bunch of papers and letters by British flute makers, and they're really funny. They're very proper in the way that they sound when you read it, but it's really just a bunch of catfights over whose design is better. They're basically like super long Twitter wars. I found another book that completely craps on double tonguing. Anything that was funny, I tried to look up because I wanted to find something that would make me laugh. I also found an amazing concerto by a composer named Chen Yi. As a Chinese North American flutist, it was amazing to find this concerto called the Golden Flute Concerto that has mixes of Western influences and Chinese influences, and it's, golden flute, and I have a gold flute. It was a lovely way for me to get into researching a piece of music that I really felt like reflected me. But the one time that I really overcame my anxiety over researching music was when I did my oral defense for my master's degree. I made a video about it, so if you want to know more about it, I will link it up here. But essentially, I was researching a Bach sonata that I was performing as part of my master's graduation recital. I don't know what it was. I think it might have been because, you know, if I didn't pass this oral defense, then I would not pass the degree. So that was a huge contributing factor to getting me to do legit research. But while I was doing the research, that's when I found out all these really cool things about the instruments that were used at the time and other pieces that Bach composed during the time that he composed the sonata, and I was able to see similarities between the two. I learned about a possible virtuoso that he probably wrote for. I am a huge behind the scenes nut. Like, I have pretty much memorized most of the Lord of the Rings behind the scenes. It finally clicked for me during my oral defense that researching music is the behind the scenes of a piece of music that you are studying. And that takes us to now. I recently realized that my channel is now one of the resources that a lot of you guys use to research music, which on one hand completely scares me, and on the other hand, I'm glad that you guys are joining the procrastination family. But coming from a person who had that much anxiety researching music, it completely blows my mind that you guys even use my channel to research music. So there you have it. Take from my experience what you will. Just keep in mind that everyone learns at a different pace, everyone learns differently, and people can even change the way they learn over time, which is what happened to me. Even if this video didn't help you directly, but maybe if it helped you understand how other people learn, I will count this video as a success. So as usual, if you guys like this video, make sure you give me a big thumbs up and hit subscribe for new videos every Saturday. My last video is over there, and if you want to catch me during the week, my social media networks are down there. But otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Bye. Don't know if I should have worn this shirt for this video, because I hope I don't end up, like, you know, messing with it too much. Anyway.